hugely grateful to be able to come and talk on something that I love for 4 hours. So really appreciate that. It was 4 hours, wasn't it? So yeah, thanks for coming. You're about to listen to the greatest badly prepared speech that has ever been delivered. As some of you will know, anyway, just to fill you in on why we're here. Myself and Emily and James are part of a group called Gaian Earth, and we've been blessed with this incredible opportunity to redesign and repurpose the purpose of a farmland in Worcestershire from a lovely soul called Ronald, who I believe Jote knows, Ronnie Cheap, and he's welcomed us onto his land, and we are birthing a new community, basically. So we're going to lay the foundations. There's going to be many things to learn. We're bringing all that we've learnt, and we're going to pioneer something that hasn't been done much in the UK. You know, there's a lot of this in Wales. There's a lot of you know, communities sort of starting up in certain parts of the world, but you know, the ashrams have been trialled and not many have really succeeded. It needs a rethink, and we really think we've got something special to teach you guys. So I would just say to you, you know, watch this space, see what we're up to. There's going to be a lot of things that we want to share with you as we progress on this journey. But really, to begin, just to give you a sense of what this is all about, I'd just like to invite you all just to close your eyes. And I just want you to do a little bit of visualization, a bit of a meditation. And I want to picture yourself inside a house with flowing hand-sculpted walls. The air inside is cool but not cold. The wooden beams release a subtle and a musky scent. And you approach and open the front door slowly. The hum and the fragrance from the explosion of life you're about to step out into greets you before you've even stepped out of the front door. You walk out and you stop in your tracks. A lush woodland glade of breathtaking beauty spreads before you. Twittering birds dash excitedly across the plots of summer vegetables, swaying grasses and wildflowers as they cram their mouths full of ripe Gilder rose berries before dashing back to their nests. Across a calm pool ringed by late summer blooms of meadow sweet and wild marshmallow, you see apple, cherry, plum and pear trees, their boughs groaning under the weight of the swollen fruit. You cross the glade and walk into a woodland, taking care not to step on the delicate leaves of abundant herbs and the last of the soft spring fruits and salad leaves that grow along the edge. As you enter, clusters of green hazelnuts still to ripen catch your eye. Further into the wood, you pluck summer mushrooms from the rich humus soil of the wooden floor, and you place them into a hand-woven wicker basket before stopping in front of a humming hive of honeybees. Just remain there for a moment. So when you're ready, just open your eyes. That was just a very small taste, a hint of a self-sufficient lifestyle based upon the natural principles found thriving along nature's most abundant and fertile ecosystem, which is the forest edge. So this small meditation is just a small taste of what happens when you reconnect your world, your home and your life back into nature. So when you plug yourself back into the life support system that was created for us. This is the reason we came here. So forest gardening and permaculture, what are they? What was it about them that convinced myself and my friends here to pack up our lives, in my case to pack in a very stable job, if there is such a thing, put my house on the market, move away from my family, hopefully not for too long, and an area, move to an area where I am basically new to. I'm coming from an area that I've lived for 16 years, to share a house with 5 or 6 others maybe, dog as well, 2 of whom you can see sat here. Now that's a big leap, but as you heard, I've carried this dream inside for probably 20 years now. This journey kind of started from childhood, where I was obsessed with forests, and then it really became clear as a viable dream that could actually be manifested after reading a series of books called The Ringing Cedars, which some of you might be familiar. And then I became passionate about forest gardening. Now forest gardening is a form of self-sufficiency that focuses on recreating nature's most stable, sustainable and abundant type of ecosystem. So it's a form of farming that's been successfully practiced by many indigenous cultures across our world for millennia. People don't realise this. Once such a garden is established, it's very low labour intensive and it can be incredibly high yielding, producing over the course of each year a vast array of the very highest quality edible and useful crops. You get fruits, nuts, vegetables, oils, resins, fibres, medicines, grains, fungi, the list goes on and on. Just talk about an example. There's a place in Italy above the Po River where you can find survivors of our ancestral forest gardens in northern Italy, and there are a handful of farms that look almost the same today as they would have 3,000 years ago. It's slightly mind-blowing to think this, but there are rows of short prune trees with fruit-laden grapevines festooned between them. The trees are common natives in the area that produce fruit, firewood, basket-making materials and fodder for any animals kept on the land. The grapes are ancient cultivars that have been grown there for millennia. Between these rows of grapes and trees are diverse plots of cereals, hayfields, vegetables, herbs. In a single field you can find staples needed to live and to support the farmstead, but there's even more to sell at the highest premium because the quality is insane. This is a very resilient system. A farm modelled on a forest, unlike monocultures of grapes or grain, are extremely durable. Diversity is a strength here. So disease outbreaks and unseasonable weather have a limited impact. So if one crop has a bad year, there are dozens of others to pick up the slack. These are agricultural ecosystems that are designed to last millennia, and that's exactly what they've done. And this system of farming and land use has shrugged off extreme climate change events, countless wars and invasions, pestilence, plagues, cultural erasure and colonization. And this is the kind of farming that we need today. It's fully immersive, 3-dimensional ecosystem that supports people and animals. It provides staples and specialty products. It increases local biodiversity, inviting wildlife back in and onto the land. and it doesn't require chemicals or elaborate technology and heavy machinery. Whereas modern industrial agriculture is descended from a distinctly, I'll just give you a bit of history. Modern industrial agriculture is descended from imperial Rome, and it's an imperialist sort of plantation system that was based on slave labor. We still have that system today. This system I've just described, called cultura promiscua, are direct descendants of the indigenous forest gardens of pre-agricultural Europe. Since the Neolithic Revolution, there's been an assortment of farming systems in Europe that relied heavily on monocultures and a handful of fragile and very fussy staple crops that usually have ended abruptly and violently. Just look at the history of our empires. Every single one has ended violently, and usually it's because the food supply, the forestry has failed or died out or been used up, the resources exhausted. The diverse forest gardens of common people or peasants, however, have quietly shrugged off 10,000 years of turbulent changes. To bring us back to Britain, here in Britain, after the glaciers retreated, and in Europe, the continent was a cold tundra of lichens, mugwort, dwarf willow, sea buckthorn, populated by sort of megafauna, huge animals, and migratory bands of humans that were returning from their Ice Age refuges in the mountains. But around about 9,600 BC, global temperatures rose about 7 degrees centigrade in less than a decade. And this allowed for populations of Mesolithic humans to expand rapidly across Europe and bring with them their most prized possession. Anybody want to have a guess what their most prized possession was?
Wait.
It's the hazel. So the hazel tree. So they began forest gardening a very, very long time ago. It's mind-blowing, in fact, because this was also mirrored around the world elsewhere. So you had indigenous cultures in North America. We know about Australia, and you can see this here, that the pollen record shows that hazel suddenly becomes common across Europe as soon as the climate warmed. It couldn't have spread that fast naturally, so it had to be getting carried. And it was brought to every corner of the continent by our ancestors. In fact, hazel was the original tree of life for Mesolithic Europeans, and it was very much, as Chris may well recall from the bardic courses that we've both done, the hazel was very much revered by our druidic ancestors. Do you remember the story of the acorn? Sorry, the hazelnuts being eaten by the salmon in the pool of wisdom. So it's very much associated with wisdom as well. The nuts are about 60% fat and 20% carbohydrates. They contain a wide range of proteins, vitamins and minerals, and a few handfuls can cover the daily needs of a very strong adult very comfortably. Its branches are tall and flexible, but slender enough to cut with an axe, and so these were used for tools, for firewoods. They were building materials, so their thatched huts were often made with hazelwood beams. We've been working with hazel. We started coppicing the woodland. The hazel's near where we are based, and we're going to be planting a lot more, so we're going to reintroduce coppicing. Coppicing is, so basically, coppicing, you'll have a hazel tree. Every 7 years you cut it right down, and then what happens is it shoots very straight and very useful, flexible and strong branches that then can be repurposed. They can be woven, they can be used, like I said, as strong support posts. It's an incredibly versatile tree, and it's something also that our wildlife has evolved around. So much of our disappearing bird life, for example, is because we've stopped these practices. You know, we've become so reliant on a construction industry that is essentially just feeding a monopoly, not because it's good for us, it's not good for the environment, it's not cost effective. You know, you can work 30 years as a slave in a miserable job to buy a pretty crappy house that is so far removed from your dream home, it's not even worth considering. So just forget about doing that. You know, instead, start looking at these regenerative, natural skills and crafts and practices, and look at ways to build a home that can be so much more beautiful than anything you can imagine that comes from the construction industry, and so much more healthful for your body. You know, an earth home, scientifically, you can measure the benefits the earth home has on the electrons and the particles and the atoms and the organs of the body. You know, we don't have to get into esoteric conversations now to know that the science is there. So excavations of archaeological sites from this period usually turn up hundreds and thousands of roasted hazelnut shells. So for over 5,000 years, this single plant was life-giver to nearly all of Europe's people. But in addition to hazel, Mesolithic people utilised up to 450 different species of edible plants, many of which were common plants of the forest edge, including wild vegetables, many of which are considered weeds today, like nettle, knotweed, lesser celandine, dock, lamb's quarters, fruits like sloe, plum, rowan, hawthorn. I mean, I've seen you've got many of these in your garden already. There's elder there, you've got hawthorn along the edge there. You know, we've got already a variety of fruits just in this space here. And these were part and parcel of their daily diet. So these European native plants were utilised for the same reason they are often seen as weeds today, because they're extremely resilient. They're aggressive. They're adaptive species that can be encouraged to grow with minimal effort. If any of you have seen my videos on Gaian Earth, you'll hear me talking about the weeds of my garden and just saying, there's a word I hate, and that is, oh, this is invasive. I used to hear my stepfather going on about, oh, daisies are invasive, you know, we've got to drive them out of the lawn. You know, I've got shining cranesbill in my garden. Oh, it's invasive. No, it's just prolific. And if it's prolific, that means you can use it, and that means you can harvest it. It will grow back, you know. You can't hurt it. It will keep growing back. So use it. Find out why it's such a good grower. Our ancestors saw these things as blessings because they knew they could harvest lots, repurpose it. I mean, the shining cranesbill in my own garden, you can make a poultice out of it, and it heals wounds. It also heals milk engorged breasts for pregnant women. You know, these are things. This is knowledge and wisdom that we've lost. And I've had to witness, you know, my ex-partner, you know, who breastfed into sort of the early years. She believed in a long breastfeeding time, which is a wonderful thing to see is coming back. But you know, she suffered, you know, it hurt. If I'd known this then, you know, I could have saved her 4 years of extreme discomfort. So these...
Is it so because it's sore on the end you put that stuff on there?
It's just, I mean, I don't know if you can speak of this, but you know, when the breast is not big, you know...
breastfeeding counsellor, that's, I think, my...
Yeah, well...
I just mean the thing that you're mentioning, was it a herb that you would rub
yeah,
on to take the pain away?
It's a relative wild geranium, so it's...
How do you eat it? That's my question. How
So,
do you actually...
so it's called geranium lucidum, and you make a poultice out of it. So you can grind it in a pestle and mortar, and just make a poultice and bandage it around the breast, or hold it around the breast, just lay it on the breast.
You usually have anti-inflammatory.
Yeah, exactly, anti-inflammatories. It'll probably gently slow the production of milk during that period without stopping it, you know. Nature is a wonderful thing, and we've evolved throughout our entire evolution around nature. So there is a symbiotic relationship that we are only just starting to rediscover, but it is there for us to now really start to learn. You know, we have to learn the language of nature because it is so abundant in its gifts that it wants to give back to us, you know. So these were not bands of starving cavemen constantly on the precipice of death, but rich and resilient societies that had a much more diet than most present-day Europeans. Today, by comparison, if we get to eat more than 30 different plants in our diet, you're lucky. Most people will probably eat a lot less, and the majority of people will really just eat 3: rice, maize and wheat. There's not much more. They're not even really rice, maize and wheat as we know it, because they've been so chemically and genetically altered. So to obtain their rich and diverse diet, Mesolithic people worked less than anyone who came after. They've shown this with Aborigine peoples, who they couldn't understand how the Aborigine culture could survive in the bush. This is the most hostile environment on planet Earth. We're working 5 to 6 days exhaustively to just raise enough money to shelter and feed our families. They went to study Aborigine cultures thinking, my God, they must be working 7 days a week, all hours of the week, just to feed and support their communities. They went there and they found they were spending 2.5 days a week foraging. The rest of the time they were dancing, singing, telling stories and going walkabout.
Sounds mint.
And they were like, we've got something wrong here. You know, this lush landscape, this green England, this green Europe, full of all this vegetation and life, and we're working 6 days exhaustively just to barely make ends
To go
meet.
to the shop to buy food that
Great
hasn't even got
food
the
that's
nutrients
making
in
us
it.
sick, you know, the taste
And
of
watching
nothing.
Netflix instead of actually dancing and singing. I do watch Netflix. I'm not
Exactly.
judging anyone else who does.
You can select what you watch on Netflix,
Yeah, you can.
and there is some good stuff on there, you know. So hunting and gathering requires just a few hours of work each day. Far easier than farming, much less modern work schedules required. So after helping to create Europe's forests by bringing favoured plants like hazel with them, they continued to manage and shape their landscape. So they weren't just hunter-gatherers. I hate that term. They weren't hunter-gatherers. They were forest gardeners. They shaped their environments. They knew to plant a tree there. You can see this with today's indigenous tribes in the rainforest. They will plant a certain tree because they know in 20 years' time it will provide a ladder to reach the figs in the higher branches of other trees. So they're already understanding this subtle relationship between the plants and the fruits and all the wondrous abundance that nature has to offer them. All it needed was a tweak, you know. It doesn't need a massive mechanical machine. So Europe was not a pristine wilderness, but it was a continent of handcrafted nut orchards and semi-wild forest gardens carefully managed for thousands of years. This tracks with common themes around the world, as we've said, with Australia, North and South America and elsewhere. Nor, though, was this anything new even then. So we talk about the Mesolithic humans because there is evidence of this, but you can go back to the Neanderthals and their ancestors. This way of life has been shaping the landscape for over 800,000 years. Just let that sink in. This way of life has been successful for over 800,000 years. Our history is not 8,000 years. This is a distortion, okay? We have an incredible, wonderfully successful and beautiful relationship with this planet that is hundreds of thousands of years old. You know, we weren't going around clubbing dinosaurs. You know, we were masters of nature and our environment. We've lost huge amounts of knowledge. You know, they say that 95% of the brain is junk. It is now. It wasn't then. I firmly believe our ancestors utilised far more of their brains because of their incredible and complex understanding of the symbiotic relationships of all life on this planet, which is a far superior science to any we have today. So these Mesolithic forest gardens were far from something new, but just the continuation of an almost unimaginably ancient tradition of land management and our ancient relationship with the ecology and life of the land. So just bringing it back to the present a little bit, just a bit more background about myself and my love and involvement for this science, whatever you want to call it. I come from a mixed background for the past 20 years, which has been split between working in the education system, both university and secondary school, and the commercial and industrial sector. And both these periods of my life generated a huge amount of stress and disillusionment for me, which I think many of us here will probably relate to with your own working lives. The education system, that oppressive meat grinder where little is learned but to obey, to fear, to conform and to compete. Kind of just force-fed children into the second system, the commercial industrial sectors. Study hard, get good grades, get a good job was the mantra that I just heard everywhere, over and over and over.
Yeah.
I must have taught in about 30 schools. And this was sold as the panacea to true happiness. And we were told this again and again and again. You know, not just by teachers, but by parents, everywhere. It just kept getting repeated until the point that you believed it. The second system, the industrial and commercial sectors, I witnessed them proceeding to groom these same children once they'd graduated and grown up and sign them up to a form of bonded slavery. This system, I discovered, was a system that never relented in its obsessive and horrendously inefficient and wasteful drive to forever increase profits, productivity and growth, regardless of the cost to the individual or the family or the environment. So I become a very replaceable cog in a very large and ugly machine that had no interest in my well-being unless that well-being began to impact on productivity. Then they might take notice, oh, what's wrong with you? Productivity's dropped. Oh, well, I'm feeling suicidal. Oh, shit, we better deal with that so you can be productive, not because you matter. So this is how it thinks. It's almost like it's taken on a life of its own. So interestingly, after my company, the world's largest independent operator of its kind in the cash industry, was recently bought out by the largest public operator, without so much as causing the Monopolies and Mergers Commission to bat an eyelid. Curious. I was then curious to know who actually owned the company who had bought me out. Sorry to name it, it's known as NCR, who you may have heard of, National Cash Register. And I did a little research, and guess what? I found out that they are owned by AT&T Corporation, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, who you might have heard of, who in turn, after a bit more research, I found out ultimately are owned by their biggest shareholder, the Vanguard Group, who have as their biggest shareholder, guess who? Elon Musk. So yeah, I was working for the world's most infamous eugenicist who wants to put a computer chip inside my brain. So that's the moment when you start to think, okay, we need to smell a rat here, you know. Sorry, Elon, if you're watching this. So very similarly to the industrial sector, during the 10 years I spent in Yorkshire schools, not only did those narrow-eyed Ofsted officers pause from their eternal pursuit, so not once did they pause from their eternal pursuit of driving up grades and in improving attendance statistics, and actually just pause for a second and begin to ask themselves if maybe it was worth also considering helping both teachers and students arrive and return home at the end of their exhausting, often miserable days with something as simple and glaringly lacking as a bloody smile on their faces. You know, was that really so hard to ask? You know, my child is spending the bulk, my children have spent the bulk of their childhood in an institution that doesn't give a shit about them being happy. So what does that say about me forcing them into that system? Can we really say we love our children in this country or any other country that supports such a system? So I used to ask, can we ever say we love our children when we cast them into these emotionally toxic bear pits with nothing better to look forward to than a life, really, of enslavement? So since when do young children grow up healthily by being forced into regimented lines of silence and taught that those around them are their competitors rather than their companions? You know, the person sat next to you is out to steal your place in the world. If they do better in the exam than you, they're going to get the job that you need to be happy. And this was the atmosphere of pressure that I grew up in. I hated school. I absolutely hated school. You know? And then, you know, I misbehaved, played up, and I didn't fulfill my potential because the school, you know, tried to force me into a direction that my whole soul was screaming was not the direction I needed to go in. How many other children are like that? And when those children, you know, step out and they scream their frustration, they get slapped with a label of being ADHD or Asperger's and so on and so forth. And the system medicates them. You know, I've seen children in floods of tears because they didn't understand these waves of depression that were hitting them, that were being triggered by the Ritalin that they were being forced to take because they didn't want to sit still and pay attention in a maths lesson that meant nothing to them. And it was heartbreaking to see this. I saw this again and again and again. So how did I survive this? There's one very simple answer. This is why I'm bringing it back round. It was my garden. So my garden saved me. My garden restored my sanity, my stability, and my strength. I remember coming home at the end of each horrendous and exhausting day and being hit by clouds of perfume from blossom-covered trees. I literally would walk through that gate and I had to stop. I just got enveloped. It was incredible. And then I remember feeling the cool of the trees, hearing the hush and the rustle of the leaves, the song of the birds, the hum of the bees, something we all experience today during the activities and the dance and the things we were doing earlier, the yoga that we were doing earlier. An explosion of colour in the springtime. I then remember so many occasions I'd wake up in the middle of the night during the witching hour normally, as the anxious demands of the next day threatened to kill any hope of sleep. And I discovered something. I discovered if I tiptoed outside so as not to wake any of my family, and I stood barefoot on the soft grass under my silver birch tree, all my anxieties would be taken away from me. And I would simply have to return to my bed and I would sleep like a baby until morning. It was that simple. There was no psychology, no technique required, no meditative discipline needed. I simply stood and I let the earth and my forest garden heal me. Mothers with crying babies, I urge you, please try this. You know, when you've got a baby who's agitated, it's probably because it's wrapped in plastic blankets. It's been so insulated from the energies of the earth. Its cells of its bodies are screaming. It doesn't understand it, but I promise you, if you hold it next to your skin and then you step outside and you step in a healthy soil and woodland or garden environment, you watch the magic happen. And watch how many occasions that baby will settle and will find peace. That applies for all of us, you know, adults, children alike. So simple. So was it spiritual or was it science? Well, the science is there now. Among the many benefits forest bathing and barefoot walking on the earth offers, science has now proven this activity floods the body with negative ions, helping balance the positive ions in our body, improves circulation, reduces inflammation, stimulates the vital organs of the body. The list of benefits goes on and on. as to being a spiritual practice, well, I've always said, if your spirituality does not involve earth spirituality, then you might as well go and be spiritual on another plane of existence. You've missed the whole point of coming here. You know, we're here to experience something very, very special and very unique. And that is the natural system that is already gifted to us on planet Earth. So if you're looking for evidence of a God or a perfect creator, then I would urge you, look no further than the soil under your feet. Leonardo da Vinci once said, we know more about the movement of the planets and the celestial bodies than we do about the soil underfoot. One handful of soil not only contains hundreds of thousands of animals, but these range across many thousands of species. I mean, they say if you take one handful of healthy soil, there's more living organisms in that soil than all the humans who live or who have ever lived on planet Earth in just one handful. If you could study the soil in a healthy English garden, particularly in this part of the world, you'll find more of the major branches of life that will be found in, say, the African Serengeti or the Amazon rainforest. It's mind-blowing. You will find insects, crustaceans, millipods, diplopods, centipedes, millipedes, hexapods, chylopods, springtails, earthworms, mollusks, arachnids, and you can just go on and on and on and on, all in this tiny area. And each one serves a unique and a specialized role. The complexity and the specialization of each of these insects, it is mind-blowing. To fathom it is beyond something that the human mind can even begin to comprehend. So when science starts pulling it apart and attempts to recreate this system with like chemical artificial fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides, they're just being idiots, absolute idiots. You know, I could go from this garden and I could walk 100 meters in that direction and you will find a whole different colony and world of highly specialized insects that are completely unique to these ones, just 100 meters away. And yet globalization thinks the same system serves every single field everywhere in the world. And they wonder why that system is becoming so fragile and their food is becoming so toxic. So let's just talk about one of these species, if you'll bear with me. We'll talk about maybe earthworms later, because that's probably the most important creature that's ever lived on planet Earth. But I'd like to talk about one you've probably never heard of, and it's called the springtail. These are groups of creatures that actually consist of several thousands of species. Springtails were thriving and surviving on the planet long before dinosaurs, and they are among the first animals that ever walked on land. In fact, scientists found a fossil springtail in prehistoric rocks that dated back about 410 million years. That means they've survived every single extinction event on Earth. They can be brown, grey, black, white, iridescent, brightly coloured, all the colours of the rainbow. These creatures can be male, female, or both. If the conditions require it, they can even give birth immaculately. So that means we've got lots of little springtail Jesuses. They have little courting rituals with the male and female. They caress each other's faces and their antennae. Although the males can sometimes get so excited, they are often found attached to the antennae of exasperated females hanging about in the air, still clinging desperately to their antennae in the hopes of the female will succumb. Kind of reminds me of males today. They can jump up to 10 millimeters in the air, which is the equivalent of a human jumping over the Eiffel Tower. And when they do this, they complete around 374 flips per second, which calculates to something like 22,440 revolutions per minute. They're amazing. and they recycled their plant material into nutrients to fertilize the soil. Sadly, we have become so disconnected from all of this life that surrounds us and is beneath us. In fact, we're currently witnessing an immense global disconnection from nature, and this has been going on for a very long time. So to cite a story that illustrates this, when the Pilgrims and pioneers set up their early settlements along the shores of North America, the North American coast, it's said, whether it's anecdotal and true or not, but this is a very interesting story. And apparently when the new arrivals arrived, they kept mocking and ridiculing the Native Americans for possessing no metal tools. And because of this, they considered the Native Americans as stupid, as ignorant, as uncultured, as uneducated, and as savages. After some time, and learning enough of the English native, a native chief, observing this behaviour, and starting to understand their comments, and seeing the contempt in the faces of these newcomers, who they'd already saved from dying of famine from multiple winters, because they didn't even know how to survive a winter when they got there. And after witnessing this incredibly insulting, disrespectful behaviour, he decided to go and speak to them. And he basically said, look, it's not that we don't know how to mine and extract and work the metals and minerals of the earth. It's just we also know that the process to extract such things is so damaging to the mother that only a very backward civilization would ever consider doing such a thing. And here we are today still doing the same dumb things. So let me demonstrate some of these dumb things. So land use. In Britain, we seem to have this idea that we're some kind of animal lover and that we love our green and pleasant countryside. We love wildlife and nature. Don't kid yourself. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. With half of its biodiversity left, it's in the bottom 10% in the world globally for biodiversity. But we've got national parks. We've got wonderful national parks. 9.3% of England is designated national park. 20% of Wales is national park. 7.2% of Scotland is national park. Whereas you've got in Poland, only 1% is national park, you know. So that sounds great. And plus, these designated national parks have very low intensity of population. So that all sounds really good. The truth is, our national parks are the largest ecological and economical waste of space in Europe. Let's just compare it to, say, Yellowstone National Park. We've all heard of Yellowstone. Yellowstone's got 95 wolves in 10 packs, 4,000 bison, 30,000 elk, 500 brown bears, 280 black bears, lynx, otters, beavers, bobcats. These all help shape and mould the ecosystem and preserve it. They've also got eagles, pelicans, cranes, ospreys. You know, it just goes on and on and on, the list of wildlife there. But, oh, Yellowstone's enormous, you know, it's a stupid comparison. Well, actually, Scotland's Cairngorms is over half the size of Yellowstone. It's 4,500 kilometres squared. The Lake District Natural Park is 2,362 kilometres squared. Snowdonians National Park is 2,130 kilometres squared. Those three are all actually very close to each other. Together, they form a national park bigger than Yellowstone. But you can go on. Kenya's Masai Mara that I've been to, and I've seen the giraffes and the zebras and the rhino. I was lucky enough to see perhaps one of the last white rhino. I've seen huge herds of animals in the Masai Mara. And yet the Masai Mara is only 1,800 kilometres squared, and it's hugely populated. You know, all those safari programs that show these empty open expanses, they turn the camera around, you probably got a bloody town right behind you selling you tourist goods. The North Yorkshire Moors is 1,400 kilometres square, which isn't that far off the Masai Mara in Kenya. And yet Poland's Biebrzę, region is only 590 kilometres squared, which seems very small compared to ours. And yet they've got elk, they've got lynx, they've got beaver, they've got wolves, they've got otters. Why have we got none of this? So the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they do a ranking of 1 to 6 for national parks. Britain has not got one single national park that ranks higher than a 5. 6 being the worst. The reality is our national parks are not for wildlife, and in fact they're not even national. In fact, less than 1% of these parks is out of private hands and is nationally owned. They're mostly intensive sheep farms, grazed to death with pitiful biodiversity. Or they are plantation woodlands of non-native species, which are as good as deserts. They are essentially land factories. One very common use of these areas and others of our moorlands are grouse moors. Now let's talk about them. 8% of Britain's land is grouse moor. In England alone, this covers 1.3 million acres of grouse moors. And yet, traditionally, these have all been getting burnt around springtime. You know, when the birds and all the animals are nesting, they burn the whole thing. They rip up the saplings. They poison predatory birds. Okay, this is unofficial, but we all know what happens. And yet they only employ around 1,750 people permanently for 8% of the country's land. They're heavily subsidised because they generate no money whatsoever. And if the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs actually said they didn't have a breakdown of subsidies received by grouse moors, don't you? Nor did they have a breakdown of the amount received by moorland farmers. Convenient omission of information. However, some claim subsidies were increased by Theresa May from 45 million to 84 million a year, just to keep those shooting grounds going for a very small elite, for 8% of the land, and yet it's for one species, red grouse. Nothing else survives there. It's horrendous use of land. Plantation woodland in this country is 8.2% of Britain, is plantation woodland. Again, this is industrial monoculture. You've got one species that is non-native. None of the wildlife here has evolved to know what to do with exotic species. This is why we encourage you always at Gaian Earth, please look for a native species first. It's not to say you can't use exotics, but if you're talking about using exotics on industrial scale, then you are forcing the wildlife out from those areas and nothing can live there. And I remember this very clearly when I went to Winlatter Forest in Cumbria. My ex and myself, we went there and it was beautiful and there was a bit of snow on the ground, but I was very excited because I've never seen red squirrels and this is supposed to be, you know, red squirrel territory. And all I can remember walking around there is, where the hell is the life? It was absolutely dead. There was nothing, not a bird song, no insects, no evidence of life, nothing. It was just row after row after row of canopy cover plantation woodland of one species of tree. But that's just plantation and grass moors. 72% of the UK is farmland. Most of this is grazing or arable feed crops for the livestock that we graze. So let's use an example. Let's talk about Wales. A lot of communities sang up in Wales because we've all got this idea, and we had the same idea. You go to Wales, and Wales is the mecca of self-sufficiency communities, awakened, conscious, nature-loving communities. I don't think they realise that Wales is extremely barren of wildlife, and this is because of Welsh livestock sheep grazing. Welsh livestock sheep pasture land occupies 88% of that country. 88%. And yet it only contributes 0.7% of the economy. It only employs 1.9% of the Welsh population. It's hugely subsidised. And yet it has 9.6 million sheep occupying an area 12 times the size of Greater London. And yet only 1.2% of the British diet comes from lamb anyway, the majority of which is imported from New Zealand. So we don't even like our own bloody lamb. And yet in 1801, the majority of the Welsh population was involved with sheep farming or wool. So just look, it has absolutely plummeted. It's in free fall. So what are we doing? It's an insane way and waste to use the land. Insane. Makes no sense whatsoever. So let's talk a bit about farming in general. So farming is responsible for about 80% of the world's deforestation. 80% of the world's deforestation has come because of farming. Farming and fishing industries have led to the decrease in wild vertebrate animals by 68% since, wait for it, 1970. 68% of all vertebrate animals have been wiped out because of our farming and fishing. Of the 28,000 species that are on the verge of extinction today, 24,000 of these are being threatened by farming. Only 29% of all the birds on Earth consist of wild species. All the rest are poultry on farms. In fact, chickens on Earth weigh more than all the other birds combined. Just chickens. I had chickens. They took 9 months to grow. They were beautiful, don't get me wrong, I love chickens. But I lived near a poultry farm. Their chickens were big enough for a supermarket shelf in 4 weeks, 4 to 5 weeks. You know, they ended up on Marks and Spencer's shelves. What the hell were they doing to get chickens to that size in 4 to 5 weeks? You know, something's going very wrong. Okay. It gets worse. Just 4% of the world's mammals are actually wild. Okay. Humans account for 36%, and the remaining 60% is livestock. Just let that sink in again. We have allowed just 4% of the world's wild animals to share this planet with us. It's crazy. In the past 20 years, insects in the UK, and this is reflected around most of the world, have declined by up to 65% in 20 years. This is why there's no insects splatting on your car windscreens. I don't know if any of you are old enough, but I remember this. You know, you were constantly, I used to feel mortified. You know, at the end of a journey, I was shaking because we'd massacred that much life on the road. You know, it was just carnage. You know, blood dripping. But equally, there's very little life left in the soil, and this is something that we're not measuring. But fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, antibiotics in the urine of the grazing animals, GM monoculture crops that give nothing back to the life and ecosystems above or below the ground, they are all contributing to destroying that amazing life in the soil that I mentioned to you earlier. 50% of the fields in this country have no life, none. Go and have a look at the fields. Go have a look at your ploughed fields. Look at them closely, look at the soil. It's dead, it's desert. The plants are single plants growing in chemical drenched dirt. It doesn't even deserve to be called soil because it is not soil. It doesn't contain any of the organic matter or the substances that soil actually requires to be considered soil. So coming back to worms, the humble earthworm was voted the most influential species in the history of the planet, yet these agri-chemicals and poisons since the 1950s have almost wiped them out from British fields and farms. You know, as I've said, a handful of soil contains more life and living beings than all the humans that live or have ever lived on the earth, and yet 2.2 million tonnes of good soil is lost from ploughed fields in this country every year because of those chemicals turning good soil into desert and because of removing the wildlife and the natural processes from the land. It's just washing off, and you'll never recover that soil. That soil is gone. It's into the bottom of the ocean. When you remove the worms, you remove the life and the strength and the structure of the soil. Worms are the most amazing creatures. In their guts, they encourage the growth of healthy bacteria. They also encourage the growth of healthy fungi. They break down toxins in the soil, so they eliminate pollution. And they also kill harmful bacteria and pathogens in their guts. So they eliminate the danger from viruses. You know, if you believe in all that, then if you're wondering where the viruses and the pathogens are coming from, look no further than your farming industry. This is actually where they're coming from. You know, there are superbugs that are developing in the soil today because the antibiotics are creating highly resistant strains of microbes. The microbes in the soil will exchange DNA information between different species. They're a huge symbiotic family. Forget Darwin, dog eat dog. It's not. It's a huge collaboration, and they will collaborate to survive. And trust me, they'll out-survive us if we don't learn to work with them. But what's happening is superbugs are being created. So don't look, you know, we hear about hospitals being breeding grounds for superbugs. No, your farms are and your food chains. That's where they will come from, not from the hospitals. It will be from your farming industry. You know, these mycelium, this fungi that develops in the worms, we all know about this now. We've seen these wonderful programs on Netflix that talk about the fungi exchanging nutrients between trees and between the roots of plants and so on. This mycelium is the structure of the soil. It also brings very hard to process nutrients to the roots of the plants. You can't just plant in soil and expect it to grow healthily. It needs the mycelium. That's part of the plant. If you look at a forest, all forests are actually a single organism. So people don't understand. They're not different species of individual trees. They're a single living, breathing, communicating, cooperating organism. And guess what? When we start to restore our relationship to the forest, and we walk, as you've all done today, barefoot on the earth, the toxins and the chemicals and the things that we release through the pores of our feet are then taken up by the mycelium. They are taken to the roots of the plants, and the plants start to alter their biological structure. It's subtle, but they develop a symbiotic relationship with the creatures that live and love them. Guess what? You then have personalized plants, you have personalized fruit, you have personalized vegetables. You know, when Hippocrates said, make food your medicine, he knew what he was talking about. So the ancient Egyptians understood the value of the earthworm when they issued a penalty of death if you deliberately harm the worms in the soil. There was a penalty of death. You know, plastics, you know, we all heard about plastics, microplastics. It's a massive thing now, plastic bags. You know, there's areas the size of Texas, just plastic floating in the ocean. Whales are washing up with stomachs full of plastics. You know, plastic, the genius invention of an industry that just had way too much raw material, crude oil on its hands, and wondered, I wonder how I can sell this stuff. And so since then, they've been inventing so many things. You know, the idea that we wear plastic clothing when it's toxic is crazy. Absolutely crazy, because all that clothing then ends up as landfill and microplastics back in the oceans. You know, William Avery Rockefeller invented the modern medical industry because he had a surplus of oil, and he saw there was basically a great way to sell more oil and more petroleum if we develop a petroleum-based medical industry and move it away from the herbal and the homeopathic remedies that were working very well and were being developed at the time. that everyone had access to. You can't monopolise herbs. You know, you can grow them in your own garden, so we don't want that. So let's get them dependent on the medical industry. However, thankfully, all that stuff that washes off into our sewers is sieved out by our wonderful sewage companies. 99% of all the plastics that wash down through our sewers and the drains and everything is sieved out by our sewage system. Sounds great. You know there's a twist to this. What I didn't know until quite recently is they then sell that sewage sludge with all that plastic back to the farmers who spread it all over their fields as fertiliser. So it just goes straight back out onto the field. As if this isn't bad enough, I also discovered that fertiliser pellets are also wrapped in plastic now. So farms are also spreading fertiliser pellets all covered in plastic film, which slows their absorption into the soil because fertilisers are very inefficient. The plants, obviously there's no mycelium, the plants can't absorb the nutrients, so they just drench them. Most of it, I can't remember the amount, it's about 58%, just gets washed off into the rivers, poisons the rivers, poisons the oceans, and poisons us. So
there is hope.
We'll get, yeah,
The
you know,
deep side, there is hope.
This is a bleak picture, but my God, if we don't know this, you know, we don't start teaching this to people, you just get apathy. You know, we need a little bit of cold water shock. You know, 1 in every 5 British mammals is now endangered. 70 species of British bird are at risk of extinction. And nearly, as I've said, 65% of all British insects have disappeared in the last 20 years. Over half of Britain's woodlands have been cut down in just the last 80 years. You know, so you can see where we're headed. That is a rate of destruction at which we can't survive. So when I'm asked questions such as, you know, which one offers the biggest yield? You know, intensive farming or forest gardening and permaculture? It's a stupid question. I'll tell you, you know, forest gardening provides a huge yield. But it's a stupid question because it's not about which system creates the biggest yield, but about which system creates the right yield for the land. If the land can't support the yield, the land will die. And it's as simple as that. And that's what we're seeing around the world. The land is dying because it can't support the yields. The crops are failing. You know, in India, we saw this with Bill Gates, his wonderful incentives to look after India because he loves them. And he created, you know, the system of genetically modified grain that produces a much bigger yield. And it's all right, we'll provide you with all the herbicides and the fungicides and the fertilizers and all the things that wheat needs to grow or that rice needs to grow. You know, we've got it all covered. We're going to look after you. Force the farmers into this system. Most of them didn't want it, but you know, they can be very heavy-handed in their selling tactics. And guess what? The first drought comes along, mass famine. The crops fail because they're so fragile. It's an incredibly fragile system. Yeah. Monoculture is incredibly fragile. One problem and the whole thing fails. The other thing you need to consider is intensive farming even producing food anymore? Just take the apple as an example. An organically, naturally grown apple contains 17 major elements, 17 key elements. A supermarket apple consists of 3. And these 3 are just the elements that stimulate the biggest growth. So an apple that, I ask you this, an apple that contains only 3 of 17 elements that make up an apple, is that actually an apple? It's a freak. It's not an apple. It's a very poor photocopy, but it's not an apple. So, you know, how do we fix this mess? You know, how do we regenerate the soil? How do we replant the lost forest, restore the wildlife, heal the land, and heal the people, who incidentally are getting more and more sick? There's more chronic illnesses today than there have ever been in the history of humanity. how do we defeat the world's insane corporations and controllers who seem to be oblivious? Yeah, they know what they're doing. To the fact that they're destroying all life as we know it. Well, I'd urge you to do what we're doing with Gaian Earth, with the farm at Perry Mill. It's about going local. Just start local, focus local, restore the one system in your local vicinity, in your local community. This is a system that was gifted to us. It's a system that's already been created, it already works, and it was designed to sustain us in every way possible. We don't need a defense system and a defense authority to protect us when we covet nothing from our neighbor, because we have everything we've ever wanted right here on our doorstep. We don't need an education system that leads us away from freedom, from joy, from creativity, and all that makes us happy and makes us feel human. One that feeds us into a system of slavery. I mean, I could talk on education, the education system alone for hours, but I'll spare you that one for another day. But just ask yourselves, though, where the word love ever appeared in your classes at school. Is that not the most important thing that separates humanity from all other things? Love. How do you build a home? Why is that not covered? When shelter, creating a shelter, being able to provide shelter for your family is essential to life. How to be healthy? Why is that not a core subject? Why is not the school system encouraging and rewarding courage or personal responsibility or kindness or wisdom? When was the last time a maths teacher told you why you were learning a particular sum, or how that sum made your world a better place? Or how and why 1 + 1 equals 3, not 2, but 3, as it does in the living mass of nature, not the dead mass of the education system. Don't need to say any more on that. We don't need an economic system created around a fantasy. Money isn't real. Crypto, sorry, it's not real. Sorry, Chris. I saw you smiling there. What? My crypto's not joking. The only things of value are those things which feed us, shelter us, nourish us, body, heart, and soul. Nature's system does that for us. We don't need a medical system when our bodies are healthy and strong. You've probably all heard about terrain theory versus germ theory. Stop selling snake oil medicines to the poor bloody fish. Just clean the bloody tank. That's all we need to do. Just clean the tank. Guess what? All those sicknesses, all those ailments will disappear. You won't need an NHS. Stop talking about saving the NHS and start talking about restoring the systems that make the necessity of an NHS obsolete. That's the solution. Yeah. So we're still recovering from the fall, the biblical fall from the Garden of Eden. But I've got news for you. We never fell. We just cut it down and burnt it. So all we've got to do is just replant it. It's a very, very simple solution. It's not rocket science. The answer is right on our doorsteps. Gardens. You asked me to come and have a look at yours, for example. Gardens. In England alone, there's over 4,500 kilometres squared of gardens, most of which contain little more than a weed killer drenched stripy lawn and a few dog turds. Little ones in your case, great. And yet this area is bigger than Britain's largest national park, the Cairngorms. It's a huge area, totally unutilised. Gardening's in our blood. It's part of our ancestry. British are traditionally incredible gardeners. So get gardening. Grow your own. Grow your own vegetables. Grow your own fruits. You don't need to have vegetable beds. Just put in bushes and trees. Forest gardening looks after itself. I've got more apples than I know what to do with. I've got more black currants, more blackberries, more red currants, gooseberries than I know what to do with. Yeah, and this is what will heal your body and your heart. So schemes as Nomo May is already catching the imagination. I think it's great. I'm really pleased with things like this. You know, let's just build on this now. There's obviously a movement starting. There's a birth of something. Something very exciting is happening. You know, so all I say is sow the seeds and leave the weeds. You know, but maybe, how do we change? You know, maybe you're wondering, how do we change the views of 7 billion people on this planet? Stop worrying about them. Just start with yourself. It starts with rejecting the idea that the individual is powerless. This is something they, the system, want you to believe, that you, the individual, are powerless. Yet every change that there ever was and ever will be started and will start with an individual. One person is all it takes. Just make sure that you are that person. Action is a very powerful thing. We were talking about this earlier. Nature supports those that not only hear its call, but act upon it. I promise you this. You know, we've witnessed this with Gaian Earth. The support came flooding in. Once like-minded, like-hearted souls came together with a shared vision, the universe just opened these doors of abundance, and these beautiful souls came in, and we were off. So believe in your power of manifestation and change, then act, and I promise you others will follow. And if they don't, I've just got 2 words for you. Try harder. That's all you need to do. If it's not happening, just try harder. We can always try a bit harder. There's a reason it's not happening. Just analyze your life, your health, your friendship groups, whatever it is, your job, your purpose in life. Don't be afraid to let things go, and then just try harder. What is it you love? What are you passionate about? What do you believe in? Just try harder. It will come to fruition. It will bear fruit, I promise you. Right, I'll shut up now. Thank you so much. That was a very bad namaste, by the way. Thank you, all of you.